edition of the Daily Debate. In tonight's show, we're going to be focusing on President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's participation in the 74th session of the United Nations General Assembly in New York that's taking place these few days. We're going to be focusing on his speech, on the main issues and main files that have the President put forward before the UN Assembly. And joining us here tonight in the studio is Ambassador Ahmed Haggag, the former Assistant Secretary General of the African Union. Ambassador Haggag, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start our discussion and our focus on the 74th UN General Assembly in New York, let's check out this report regarding the main issues and files that President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's sixth participation put forward before the Assembly.
President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi addressed the 74th session of the United Nations General Assembly, which started its activities in New York and will last for a whole week. In his address before the UNGA, President al-Sisi displayed Egypt's vision concerning many regional and international issues, in addition to crises and challenges facing the Middle East region, including terrorism and the deadlock in negotiations on the Palestinian cause, as well as the instability in some regional states. President al-Sisi called on collaborating international efforts to fight terrorism and draw up a comprehensive vision on strengthening joint global action to serve development issues. His speech focuses on Egypt's stances towards the latest regional and international developments, especially in the domains of preserving world peace and security, as well as fighting terrorism. The President's speech centered on international efforts to counter terrorism and extremist thoughts, besides economic, social, and development fields, and African affairs in his capacity as the chairman of the African Union. On Africa, the President outlined Egypt's vision on ways to boost the implementation of the Agenda for 2063 for the Black Continent's inclusive economic growth and sustainable development, and help the continent's needs to fund its infrastructural projects and implement agreements to boost intra-African trade. The President reviewed Egypt's continuous efforts to promote Africa and develop its capabilities, plus settling the continent's problems, disputes, and crises, being the current chair of the African Union. On President al-Sisi attended a climate action summit and outlined Egypt's visions and positions regarding climate issues. Sisi also addressed a number of high-level conferences which were held on the fringe of the UN General Assembly to tackle the current challenges facing the international community. President al-Sisi, meanwhile, participated in a number of high-level forums which addressed the current challenges facing international communities. On the sidelines of his participation at the UNGA, President al-Sisi held a series of meetings with a number of world leaders to review bilateral ties and discuss issues of mutual concern. He also held expanded meetings with notable American figures, officials, and chairmen of companies for talks on enhancing bilateral relations and promoting American investments in Egypt. Sisi has participated in the UN General Assembly meetings 5 times before, since 2014 until 2018, as this round will mark his 6th participation. During the week-long annual session, from September 17th till the 24th, the heads of states, diplomats, and business leaders from around the world are setting next year's political and humanitarian agenda, with objectives that include high-level events such as the Climate Summit, financing for development, and a review of the CID's accelerated modalities of action pathway. President al-Sisi also met with the President of the UN General Assembly, Maria Fernanda Espinosa, discussing ways to strengthen strategic partnership between the AU and the UN. President al-Sisi confirmed Egypt's interest in multilateral diplomacy as well as its keenness to undertake its responsibilities towards developing the role of the UN so as to address current international challenges. He also noted the importance of international collective action to establish the pillars of peace, security, and stability worldwide, and therefore confirmed Egypt's keenness to continue to actively participate in UN peacekeeping missions. He also confirmed the importance of concerted efforts by the international community to reach political settlements for the region's crises, so as to preserve countries' unity, territorial integrity, and people's resources.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, starting off our discussion right away. Ambassador Haggag, first of all, this is the 6th time the President goes to the UN General Assembly and meets all the world leaders, gives his speeches there. Now, this time around, he's not just going as the President of Egypt, but also as a head of the African Union. Yourself being a former assistant to the Secretary General of the Organization of African Union. Now, does that carry a little bit of a different weight for Egypt participating in such a summit? Does it put more responsibilities and much more of a pressure on the President? And do they take note of it now that the other world leaders of the international community, that it's not just the President of Egypt, it's the head of the African Union as well?
I think President Sisi was careful to assert his chairmanship of the African Union at present. He spoke before in the summit for health coverage of citizens, and he mentioned that Egypt is going to extend its health coverage and treatment of African into 1 million African, 100 million, the one in Egypt, but Egypt is going to treat 1 million African citizens. And I was struck by his meeting with President Trump. President Trump, although he rarely speaks on Africa, he was conscious about the role of President Sisi as the President of the African Union, and he mentioned in particular his role in achieving the continental free trade zone in Africa. So I think it is his role as President of the African Union is noticed and appreciated. And many other meetings with other leaders in attending the General Assembly was conscious about this role also. So I think in his speech, he mentioned Africa and more than one time.
Yes.
And also he was careful to meet African leaders, attending the meetings, and also the Secretary General of the United Nations and the General Assembly President, who is an African himself from Nigeria.
Well, Ambassador Haggag, the President put forward many files and many issues such as climate change, healthcare, fighting extremism and terrorism, talking about trade, talking about peace and the stability and sovereignty of many regional crises. But first off, let's take a look at the climate change. Now, the President reiterated before more than once that Africa has probably the least emissions of greenhouse gases, yet it still is the most affected region by such a phenomenon. Now, putting forward such an issue and such a file for the whole of Africa, how do you imagine the rest of the international community and the UN Assembly would respond to the phenomena of climate change affecting Africa?
We have to remember that President Sisi chaired a group of African heads of state asked to promote African position on climate. He participated in the Paris conference, the summit on presented African position, and also he never he always mentioned that Africa will be the most affected of the continent. It has not have the resources to make adaptation, environmental adaptation to climate change. That's why he is calling on the international community, especially the financial organization, the World Bank, the IMF, the African Development Bank, and the other international, to assist generously Africa to cope with the effects of climate change. Climate change is not only cutting of the trees, floods, droughts. it is going to affect the level of the sea. And although they say each year is going to increase by 4 millimeters, but in 10 years or 100 years, it will be 4 meters,
Yes.
which will engulf a lot of coastal areas in Africa and will lead to a lot of affecting the economic developments of many African countries.
Yes.
So
Yes, well, it is a very important issue since already Egypt is following its vision of achieving sustainable development for 2030 and the whole of Africa achieving this sustainable development in 2063. So it is quite an integral issue to deal with the climate change in order to achieve and accomplish such a goal and vision. Now, do you think the international community would be, as you've mentioned, generous enough in their participation and in their tackling of such an issue with the African continent?
you have to speak about this issue a lot, to press other European leaders and world leaders about the importance of assisting African countries. And we have to raise it in the forums of the African Union and at the United Nations, in the environmental meetings. Africa is in Nairobi. They are having the United Nations environmental program, which I've been representative of Egypt in this program. And it is not only African countries who are participating, but European and American, Japanese, Chinese. So those are the forums you have to press. But Africa also have to take its charge of its own programs, not to wait for financial aid, although it's welcome, but also to adapt. First of all, you have to tell the people the effect of neglect of measures to combat climate change and how to deal with droughts and floods. So it is a paradox that some parts, even in some countries, they complain of a lot of water and a lot of drought in a sequence which is making so you have to find new methods to irrigate your land and to make a public campaign to educate the population about these effects, which will affect the people themselves and their economic development.
Yes, definitely.